Now, as you remember, your camera will allow you to adjust the aperture, shutter speed, and sensitivity. Let's look at the effect on a photograph. This right here is a great chart to use to think about this. So up here we've got the aperture, and the aperture, remember, is the size of the hole. Okay, the bigger the numbers, 32, bigger than 22, the smaller the hole. The way that I remember that is old people squint. So as the numbers go up, as you get older and older, if you're 32, you're squinting more than when you were 2.8. That's what this down here, this is 2.8. Or when you were 2 years old, you were so wide-eyed. Man, you get old. If you got 64, you'd be really squinty. Okay, so that's the size of the hole. Now, the effect of it is to obviously let in less light when the hole is small, but it also affects the look of the picture in another way. The image is much sharper foreground to background, called the depth of field, with a small hole than with a big hole or a large aperture, small aperture number. The way I remember that is that little kids are like focused on, oh, lollipop, right? They just see what's just right in front of them. Whereas an old person is like, well, if I eat that lollipop and my blood sugar, I don't know. I ought to think about that. And they're taking into account all these things. They can see a lot of things forward and backwards. The kid is like just present in the thing they're focused on. Little kid, 2-year-old, and 32 is not so old, but you can imagine 64 and 128. Okay, so that's the effect of aperture. And then the effect of the shutter speed is how much blur you'll see in motion. So this is the shutter speed set of numbers here. And if the lens is open, if the shutter is open for a long period of time, and the thing in front of the shutter, in front of the lens is moving, you'll capture that thing here, 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 and you get a blur. And so half a second, the running person is a blur, and at a thousandth of a second, even though they're running, they look very, very, very still. And so that's going to affect not only the amount of light that gets in, but also the look of the photograph that way. And then the sensitivity here at the bottom, the ISO, the numbers as they get bigger, sensitivity, as they get bigger, get more sensitive. And the way I remember that is that old people tend to get bruised more easily, so it doesn't take as much light to bruise them. And so if you think of like the sensor as getting bruised to make the picture, the old people just get a little bit of light in and they get bruised, whereas a young person, like a 50-year-old person, gosh, it's hard to bruise them. But once they're 400 years old, or 800, or gosh, once they're 12,800 years old, it's very easy to bruise them. That's just the way I've always remembered it. So the aperture, shutter speed, and sensitivity work together. In the case of the sensitivity, it's more sensitive. It's also grainier, so it changes the grain. So the aperture affects the depth of field. A short hand for that is DOF. The shutter speed affects motion blur. Need to let an L, blur, motion blur. And the sensitivity affects grain or noise in the photograph. All right. Now, before I end this, I just want you to be aware, when you're setting up a photograph, only certain combinations are going to work. So, for example, if you really want a wide depth of field where the background, the mountains, and the person are in focus, and you use this very little hole, you're going to either have to have a very long shutter speed, let in a lot of light, maybe for a given amount of if you're in a given situation, you might be able to get away with 1/8 of a second, whatever. It doesn't have to be right what's below it, but a certain amount of light. You're going to have to let in maybe a longer amount of light. Or you're going to have a high ISO or some combination thereof. You can't just say, gosh, I really want that, but I want a super fast shutter speed and a super low ISO, unless you're in an incredible, very, 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 very brightly lit place. That's not going to work because that's a tiny hole, very fast shutter speed, and not very sensitive. So there are only certain combinations that work in a given situation. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about how you make those adjustments.